The silence of Erebus was a tangible thing. It was a silence Reese had cultivated, a quiet he had earned after a lifetime of noise. Here, on the tidally locked moonlit orbiting a distant gas giant, the only sounds were the ones he made himself. The gentle hum of the atmospheric processors, the crunch of his boots on the grey regolith, and the happy, panting breaths of Gizmo. The little dog, a motley collection of scruffy terrier and something indefatigably cheerful, trotted ahead, his tail a flag of defiant life against the stark, monochrome landscape. For 5 years, this had been their universe. Reese coaxed life from sterile dust, and Gizmo explored every new patch of moss and hardy lichen as if it were a continent. Under the dim, perpetual twilight cast by the swirling clouds of the gas giant, they had found a peace that felt as solid and real as the rock beneath their feet. Reese paused, leaning on his reclamation shovel, and watched Gizmo chase a dust devil kicked up by the recycler drone. The dog was a chaotic, beautiful mess of biology, a living contradiction to the sterile perfection Reese had once been forced to engineer. Gizmo was all instinct and joy, a creature of imperfect, wonderful life. In his previous life, Reese had designed weapons that could unmake worlds. Here, with Gizmo at his side, he was simply a man making one. He had built this habitat, laid the nutrient lines, seeded the first extremophile bacteria. He was a gardener on a cosmic scale, and the single, perfect flower in his garden was the unconditional affection of his scruffy, four-legged companion. His work was slow, generational, but it was good. It was creation, not destruction. The arrival was as silent as the landscape. There was no thunderous entry, no searing plume of plasma. One moment the horizon was empty, the next a ship was there. It was a perfect, seamless dart of polished, obsidian-like material, hovering 100 meters above the ground without any visible means of propulsion. It absorbed the dim light, reflecting nothing. It was a hole in reality, an intrusion of absolute order into his carefully curated world of nascent life. Gizmo stopped chasing the dust, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Reese felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he'd left the hegemony military behind. He placed a hand on Gizmo's back, a gesture meant to be reassuring, but his own hand trembled slightly. The ship was Xylan. He recognized the brutalist, geometric perfection from intelligence briefings he'd tried for years to forget. A ramp extended, not with a hydraulic hiss, but with the silent fluidity of liquid metal reshaping itself. 2 figures descended. They were tall, impossibly slender, encased in form-fitting suits of the same polished chrome as their vessel. They moved with a disturbing, synchronous grace, their feet barely disturbing the dust. As they approached, Reese could see no features, only the blank, reflective surface of their helmets. Unidentified hominid, one of them stated. The voice was not broadcast. It was synthesized directly inside Reese's head, a sterile, toneless intrusion of pure data. You are trespassing on a designated Xylan technocracy survey site. Your biological terraforming project is inefficient and unsanctioned. Reese swallowed, keeping his hand firmly on Gizmo, who was now trembling, not with aggression, but with fear. This world was uncharted. I claimed it under the Frontier Homestead Act. Your primitive laws are irrelevant, the second Xylan stated, its voice indistinguishable from the first. It took a step forward, and a dozen holographic data streams flickered around its gauntlet. Our scans detect a significant biological contaminant in your possession, a mobile, uncontained vector for uncontrolled cellular mutation and parasitic organisms. Reese's blood ran cold. He looked down at Gizmo, then back at the featureless helmets. He's my dog, he's not a contaminant. Define dog, the first Xylan commanded. He's a companion, a pet, Reese said, his voice pleading. He's harmless. Irrelevant, the second Xylan stated. Its arm rose, a small, cylindrical device extending from its wrist. All non-native, non-sanctioned biologicals must be neutralized to preserve technological and environmental purity. Protocol 7 Gamma. Panic flared in Reese's chest, hot and sharp. He pulled Gizmo behind him. No, you can't. He's just an animal. He's my friend. The words sounded feeble, sentimental, even to his own ears. He knew he was trying to explain color to a creature that only saw in binary. The Xylans paused for a fraction of a second, a motion so slight it was barely perceptible. The lead alien tilted its head. Analysis, friendship, a subroutine for inefficient emotional codependency. Your attachment is noted as a symptom of biological primitivism. It does not alter protocol. Before Reese could move, before he could even scream, the device on the Xylan's wrist glowed with a soft blue light. It wasn't a beam or a bolt. It was a wave, a ripple in the very fabric of space. It washed over Gizmo, who was cowering behind Reese's legs. There was no sound, no yelp of pain. For an instant, the dog's form shimmered, his fur, his eyes, his very substance losing cohesion. He became a constellation of fading blue motes, a cloud of dissolving light. Then there was nothing. Not even ash. Just sterilized, empty space where his only companion had been a second before. Reese stared, his mind refusing to process the silent, absolute erasure. The Xylan stood impassively, contaminant neutralized, the first one intoned in his mind. You will dismantle your operation within one solar cycle. The technocracy will claim this moon for proper, efficient resource extraction. They turned in perfect unison and glided back toward their silent, perfect ship. Reese didn't watch them go. He just stood there, his hand still frozen in the air where his friend's back had been, staring at the empty patch of dust in the vast, suffocating silence of Erebus. From the sterile bridge of the survey vessel Precision, Subdirector Kliss reviewed the mission log. The ship ascended with silent, flawless grace, the grey moon shrinking into just another pockmarked sphere on the primary view screen. He cross-referenced the data from the surface encounter. Subject: unidentified hominid, likely a renegade from the chaotic Terran systems. Technology level: Tier 9, borderline primitive. Engaged in laughably inefficient organic terraforming, a practice abandoned by any serious race for millennia. Psychological profile: susceptible to irrational emotional attachments to lesser biologicals. Conclusion: a non-threat, an insect. Log the encounter, Kliss transmitted to his second-in-command, its chrome-suited form standing perfectly still beside him. Designate Kepler 1649 CII for Tier 1 resource reclamation. The hominid's equipment is to be jettisoned into the primary. His protestations are noted and dismissed. Acknowledged, Subdirector, came the identical, toneless reply. The biological contaminant was neutralized with 99.9% efficiency. Residual organic molecules have been rendered inert. Excellent, Kliss stated. A schematic of Reese's atmospheric processor appeared on a floating display. Kliss gestured at it dismissively. Look at this. Chemical catalysis and crude fission reactors. It's a museum piece. He uses organic matter as a fuel source. Filthy. That he could even make this barren rock support a blade of grass with such archaic methods is a testament to his species' stubbornness, I suppose. But it is the stubbornness of weeds, not the strength of a mountain. The Xylans prided themselves on their absolute understanding of the universe through the lens of pure technology. To them, emotion was a flaw in the code, a glitch in the hardware of sentient thought. The grief they had witnessed in the primitive human was no different than a feedback loop in an overloaded circuit, messy, pointless, and ultimately a sign of inferiority. They had scanned his habitat, his tools, his body. They found no advanced weaponry, no powerful energy signatures, nothing that registered as a threat on any conceivable metric. They saw a broken old man, a Luddite playing in the dirt on the edge of nowhere. Their underestimation was not just arrogance, it was a fundamental axiom of their entire civilization. They had made their assessment, filed their report, and moved on. The grieving farmer and his sanitized pet were already a forgotten footnote in a routine survey mission. On the surface, Reese did not move for a long time. The spot where Gizmo had vanished seemed to burn in his vision, a negative image seared onto his retinas. The silence he had once cherished now pressed in on him, a physical weight. Every corner of the habitat, every path they had worn into the dust, every empty space was now a monument to his loss. The quiet joy of their life had been replaced by a void. He finally turned and walked back toward the habitat, his steps heavy, mechanical. Inside, the half-eaten bowl of Gizmo's food sat by the door. The worn sleeping mat in the corner was still indented with the shape of his small body. Reese felt something within him break. It wasn't a loud, shattering thing. It was a silent, crystalline fracture. The grief was an ocean, vast and cold, but as he stood there in the crushing emptiness, a new current began to stir within that ocean. It was cold, precise, and utterly without pity. The part of him that was a farmer, a gardener, a peaceful man seeking solace, died in that moment. It was scrubbed from his being as cleanly and efficiently as Gizmo had been. What was left was the engineer, the weaponsmith, the man who had designed Project Cerberus. He walked past the living quarters, his face a mask of stone, and approached the far wall of the main engineering bay. The wall was covered in geological survey readouts and atmospheric composition charts. He placed his palm on a specific panel. There was a click, and the entire wall section slid away with a quiet hiss of hydraulics, revealing not rock, but reinforced, military-grade plasteel. A retinal scanner glowed, bathing his face in red light. Voice identification required. A calm, female voice echoed in the small space. Reese took a breath, his own voice sounding alien to him, stripped of all warmth. Reese Valerius, lead engineer, authorization code, Cerberus 001. Authorization confirmed. Welcome back, Director, the voice replied. The plasteel door slid open, revealing a dark, cavernous space beyond. As Reese stepped through, motion-activated lights flickered on, illuminating not a dusty storage room, but a state-of-the-art laboratory and military command center. It was a ghost of his past, hermetically sealed and preserved beneath the bedrock of his new life. Holotanks stood dormant, server banks hummed with latent power, and in the center of the room, on a sterile pedestal, sat a silver canister no bigger than his fist. He walked to it, his reflection warped and distorted on its polished surface. This was his great sin and his greatest creation, the Cerberus nanites, a weapon so horrific the Terran hegemony had classified its existence, scrubbed it from every record, and paid him a king's ransom to disappear forever, to take his knowledge to the grave. The nanites were not designed to kill people, but to kill civilizations. They were microscopic machines that could tear apart technology from the inside out, self-replicating and adaptive. He had retired to Erebus to ensure this horror was never unleashed. He had chosen to create life to atone for creating the ultimate form of technological death. The Xylans had called his work primitive. They had called his friend a contaminant. Their fatal mistake was not in killing his dog. It was in showing him that their sterile, perfect, technological empire was, in its own way, just another form of life, and all life he knew could be engineered to end. He picked up the canister, the metal cold against his skin. The grief was gone, burned away by the cold fire of purpose. He was no longer Reese the farmer. He was the engineer of ruin. The air in the subterranean laboratory was cold, sterile, and recycled, a stark contrast to the thin, manufactured atmosphere Reese had been breathing for years. This was his tomb, the monument to a past self he had tried to bury. As the lights reached full power, they revealed a space dedicated to the art of absolute systemic destruction. It was clean, orderly, and soulless. It felt like coming home. Reese moved with a purpose that had long been dormant, his fingers flying across hollow keyboards and initializing systems that hadn't been active in nearly a decade. The lab's quiet hum deepened into a thrum of immense computational power. Director, the lab's AI, Calypso spoke. Her voice was calm, a soothing alto he had programmed to contrast the horrific nature of their work. Your biometrics indicate elevated cortisol and a dangerously low resting heart rate. You have not ingested nutrients in 12 hours. Recommend. Override, Reese said, his voice flat. Calypso, open project file Cerberus Prime, full authorization. A moment of silence. Director, that file is sealed under Hegemony Edict 749. Opening, it will trigger a final resort quarantine protocol on my core programming. I am aware, Reese stated, not looking up from a diagnostic screen. I am the final resort, open it. Acknowledged. The central hollow tank flickered to life, displaying a rotating, three-dimensional model of the original Cerberus nanite. It was a masterpiece of malevolent engineering, a fractal design of intersecting crystalline structures capable of deconstructing any inorganic material at the atomic level. It was a weapon of brute force, a microscopic sledgehammer. It was not what he needed. Brute force was for lesser minds. The Xylans worshipped perfection, order, and technological supremacy. He would not smash their idols. He would make the idols themselves crumble from within. He placed the silver canister into the master fabrication port. With a hiss, the container was opened in a hard vacuum, and a small, shimmering cloud of what looked like liquid mercury floated into the chamber. This was the base strain, billions of dormant nanomachines awaiting instructions. Reese began to code, his mind a whirlwind of fury and focus. He wasn't just writing commands, he was composing a symphony of decay. He pulled up the old hegemony intelligence files on Xylan technology that he had stored deep in the lab's memory banks. Their systems were networked, integrated to a degree that made the old hegemony look like disparate, warring tribes. Their strength, their seamless unity, would be their downfall. His plan was not to create a plague that consumed. That was too crude, too loud. He was designing a pathogen of entropy. He named it the Grey Plague, not for its color, but for the insidious way it would operate, blurring the lines between function and failure. First, he programmed the nanites for subtlety. They would mimic the signature of background radiation, of minor data packet loss, of the faint quantum jitter inherent in all advanced systems. They would be invisible to Xylan diagnostics because they would disguise themselves as the universe's natural state of imperfection, a concept the Xylans fundamentally rejected. Next, he altered their primary function. They would not deconstruct. They would introduce error. A single nanite, infecting the power conduit of a warship's main cannon, would not cause it to explode. It would alter the energy flow by 0.001%, just enough to throw off the targeting solution by a few meters over a light second. A cluster of them in a navigational array wouldn't shut it down. They would subtly warp the spacetime calculations, making a ship arrive a few thousand kilometers from its intended destination. In a databank, they wouldn't erase information. They would change a single bit in a trillion, turning a 1 into a 0. His masterstroke was their replication protocol. The Grey Plague would not multiply by consuming matter. It would replicate using the Xylan's own energy systems. Every time a ship charged its weapons, every time a planetary grid rerouted power, a tiny fraction of that energy would be siphoned off to create new nanites. The more powerful the Xylans became, the more they used their technology, the faster the disease would spread. Their own strength would be the engine of their decay. For 3 days, Reese worked, heedless of Calypso's increasingly urgent warnings about his physical state. He was no longer a man of flesh and blood. He was an extension of the machine, a conduit for a single, perfect, vengeful idea. The grief for Gizmo was the furnace, and his genius was the hammer, forging a weapon of unparalleled subtlety. He was building a god of small errors, a demon of fractional mistakes. He was crafting a disease that would kill an empire not with a bang, but with a billion tiny, untraceable whispers of failure, until the entire, perfect machine of the Xylan technocracy ground to a halt, riddled with a technological cancer of his own design. Finally, it was done. He slumped back in his chair, his body screaming with exhaustion, but his mind icily serene. In the fabrication chamber, the silvery cloud had been replaced by a fine, almost invisible dust. "Calypso," he rasped, his throat dry, "fabricate a standard Tier 6 data probe, insulate the core with a null quantum shell, load the Grey Plague into the core, prepare it for stealth launch." "Probe fabricated," the AI replied. "Vector payload loaded, awaiting launch coordinates." Reese looked at a secondary screen, which showed the faint, fading energy trail of the Xylan survey ship, the Precision. They were heading back toward the Xylan core worlds, back to spread their gospel of perfection. "Target the receding vessel," Reese commanded, his voice trembling with a terrifying, righteous calm. "Launch when ready." On the bridge of the Precision, Subdirector Kliss was finalizing his report. The data from Kepler 1649 CII was collated, the resource estimates confirmed, and the encounter with the primitive hominid logged as a minor footnote. To him, the mission was already over, a success measured in quantifiable data points and adherence to protocol. The ship sliced through the void, a silent testament to Xylan ingenuity, its internal systems humming in perfect harmony. "Subdirector," his second-in-command intoned, its chrome helmet swiveling a precise 2 degrees. "We are detecting a small, sublight object on an intercept trajectory, Terran origin, low energy signature." Kliss brought the object up on the main screen. It was a simple, utilitarian probe, little more than a cylinder with a few sensor antennae. It was broadcasting a standard low-level identification signal. A probe, from the primitive, Kliss's internal synthesizer conveyed a tone of dismissive amusement. What is he trying to do? Send us a strongly worded letter? Analyze it. If it poses any threat, disintegrate it. The ship's powerful sensors bathed the probe in a dozen different scanning fields. The results were instantaneous and unremarkable. Analysis complete, the second reported. Object is a Tier 6 data storage device. No weapon systems, no power source beyond a simple chemical battery. It appears to be a passive data capsule. He's offering data, perhaps a formal surrender of his claim, Kliss mused. How quaint. Bring it aboard. I am curious what trivialities a mind like that considers important. A tractor beam, precise to the nanometer, locked onto the probe and guided it smoothly into a sanitized analysis bay deep within the ship. A trio of maintenance drones descended upon it, their multi-jointed arms methodically dismantling the casing. They found what they expected, a crude data crystal housed within a simple lead-and ceramic shell. The data core is rudimentary, the chief technician reported directly to Kliss's mind. The encoding is primitive but legible. The data itself appears to be geological surveys of the moon. He is sending us his own work. A pathetic gesture of relevance, perhaps. Download the data and sterilize the probe's remnants, Kliss ordered, his interest already waning. Log it as irrelevant communication from indigenous populace. The technicians interfaced the data core with the ship's main computer. For a fraction of a second, as the data transferred, the ship's diagnostic systems registered a surge of anomalous entropy within the storage matrix, the kind of benign error that sometimes occurs when interfacing pristine technology with archaic hardware. It was flagged, logged, and automatically corrected. The downloaded files were, as expected, useless. The matter was forgotten. But the infection had taken root. The gray plague, microscopic and cloaked as random noise, flowed from the data core into the ship's systems. The nanites did nothing at first, simply allowing themselves to be carried on the streams of data and energy that were the vessel's lifeblood. They were patient. The first hint of a problem came hours later. The navigator, a third-level intellect named Xyla, noted a discrepancy in its FTL calculations. The projected exit point from the hyperspace jump was off by 0.00012%. It was a meaningless deviation, easily corrected, but it was also, theoretically, impossible. Xyla ran a full diagnostic on the nav computer. The result came back clean. All systems were operating at 100% efficiency. Xyla, logically, concluded the error was its own. It self-reported for a cognitive recalibration, chastising itself for the lapse in precision. Later, a power distribution node in the aft section reported a 0.02% dip in energy efficiency for a single nanosecond. The supervising engineer ran a check, found nothing, and blamed a momentary fluctuation from the ship's fusion core. It was illogical to assume a system-wide flaw, so the anomaly was attributed to a localized, transient event. In the mess hall, a food synthesizer produced a nutrient paste that was, according to one crew member's chemical analysis, 2 parts per million too high in sodium. The machine was flagged for routine maintenance at the next starbase. Each event was isolated, each was dismissed. Kliss, reviewing the ship's hourly performance logs, saw a dozen of these tiny, insignificant errors. Individually, they were statistical noise, but together they formed a pattern, a quiet, spreading stain of imperfection. He did not see it. His entire culture, his entire way of thinking was incapable of seeing it. He saw a series of minor, unrelated component and operator faults. The idea that his perfect ship could be sick was a thought he could not form. As the Precision prepared for its final jump to the Xylan sector capital, it was no longer just a survey vessel. It was a carrier, a patient zero. It was delivering Reese's eulogy for his dog, a eulogy written in the language of cascading failure, to the very heart of the empire that had wronged him. The Precision docked at Xylo's central space dock, a crystalline lattice of a station that orbited the Ecumenopolis homeworld like a crown jewel. As per standard procedure, the ship's logs, sensor data, and crew diagnostic reports were automatically uploaded to the Imperial Archive Network, a seamless repository of all knowledge and data within the technocracy. It was a routine data dump, one of thousands that occurred every hour across the Empire. No one noticed the ghost that slipped through the firewalls with the data stream. The Grey Plague, cloaked in the guise of benign information, had breached the heart of the Empire. The first signs were dismissed as curiosities. On the colony world of Cygnus X1 Prime, the planetary maglev transit system, renowned for its punctuality measured in microseconds, began experiencing route optimization errors. Trains would inexplicably slow, arriving seconds behind schedule. The systems governing AI reported all hardware was functioning perfectly and attributed the errors to atmospheric drag miscalculations, an embarrassing but ultimately trivial flaw in its own predictive models. Weeks later, at the orbital shipyards of Meridian, a military quality assurance drone flagged a series of newly forged Durasteel hull plates. The flaw was microscopic, a crystalline misalignment so minor it was on the bleeding edge of theoretical detection. The factory's supervising intelligence was decommissioned for producing imperfect materials, its core programming wiped. The flawed plates, however, had already been installed on a dozen new patrol cruisers. The whispers of imperfection grew louder. A stellar energy collector, funneling power from a blue giant, suffered a containment field flicker. The resulting energy arc, while contained, incinerated a priceless scientific array. The official report blamed a solar flare of unprecedented and unpredictable quantum character. A fleet of cargo haulers, all using the same recently updated navigation software, warped into their destination system, scattered across millions of kilometers, their entry points wildly inaccurate. The software's lead programmer, a Xylan of impeccable record, was summarily executed for incompetence. The technocracy's response was predictable and fatally flawed. Faced with 1,000 points of failure across their perfect empire, they could not conceive of a systemic disease. Their rigid logic demanded a cause, and the only cause they could comprehend was malice, incompetence, sabotage. The Emperor, from his obsidian throne on Xylos, declared a state of technological emergency. He initiated the Purity Inquisition, a ruthless campaign to root out the traitors and incompetents who were contaminating the perfection of the state. The Inquisition became a wildfire of paranoia. Brilliant engineers who reported unexplainable glitches were accused of creating them. Cautious commanders who delayed fleet movements due to unreliable systems were deemed cowards or saboteurs. The Xylans began to tear themselves apart. Executions became daily news. The Empire's greatest minds were systematically eliminated, not by an outside force, but by their own unshakable belief in their own infallibility. They were hunting a phantom, and every empty accusation only fueled the plague's advance. On Erebus, Reese watched the chaos unfold. His hidden laboratory had become an observatory of galactic collapse. He had sliced into the Xylan network through 1,000 backdoors, a silent spectator to the havoc he had wrought. He monitored their news transmissions, intercepted their panicked internal communications, and watched the charts of their cascading infrastructure failures. There was no joy in him, only a chilling, resonant finality, like a mathematician watching a complex proof resolve to its elegant, inevitable conclusion. He had become a god of their machine, a digital wraith haunting their data streams. He saw the report of the Meridian shipyard incident and cross-referenced it with the patrol cruiser's service logs, predicting the exact moment their hulls would suffer catastrophic failure under high-G maneuvers. He watched the Inquisition broadcast the execution of a famed propulsion scientist, knowing the man was innocent and that his death would cripple their FTL development for a generation. He was not just a saboteur, he was a cultural pathologist, observing the terminal stages of a disease he had personally engineered. The grief for Gizmo had been a supernova of emotion, but its aftermath was a cold, expanding nebula of pure, methodical purpose. The Xylans were an equation, and he was simply solving for zero. The escalation wasn't just about failing technology anymore. It was about the collapse of trust, the death of logic, and the self-immolation of a civilization too arrogant to look for a flaw in its own reflection. The final battle for the soul of the Xylan technocracy was not fought in the cold vacuum of space. There were no flashing lasers, no exploding warships. It was fought in the most secure location in the Empire, the Emperor's Sanctum Sanctorum on Xylos, a chamber shielded from all forms of electronic, physical, and even quantum intrusion. It was here that the beheading would take place. The Empire was bleeding. Its fleet was hobbled by unforeseen mechanical failures. Its supply lines were in chaos due to logistical miscalculations, and its leadership caste was decimated by the Purity Inquisition. In a desperate attempt to restore order, the Emperor had summoned the remaining members of the High Council, the handful of ministers and military leaders who had survived the purges, for a final, decisive summit. They would use the Sanctum's pure technology, isolated from the wider, contaminated network, to identify the source of the rot and cauterize it for good. Reese watched them gather. A compromised sensor on a sanitation drone in the corridor outside the sanctum was his only eye, but it was enough. He saw the chrome-suited figures glide into the chamber, their movements stiff with fear and suspicion. The great plasteel doors, designed to withstand a supernova, hissed shut, sealing them in their technological tomb. For the first time since he'd begun, Reese leaned forward in his chair on Erebus, his knuckles white. The final subroutine of the Grey Plague, dormant until this very moment, was programmed to activate when the Sanctum's internal systems registered the biosignatures of the entire Xylan Leadership Council simultaneously. It was a dead man's switch, built into the heart of their power. Inside the Sanctum, the Emperor ascended to his throne, a marvel of engineering that directly integrated his consciousness with the room's command functions. The contagion of failure ends today, his voice echoed, synthesized and amplified by the room itself. The last of the traitors will be unmasked. Our perfection will be restored. As he spoke, the first failure occurred. The main holo display, which was supposed to show the faces of the accused, flickered and died. A small error message appeared. FTL comms relay synchronization error. They were cut off. A murmur of unease passed through the council. Silence, the Emperor boomed. The system is merely purging corrupt data. Then the lights flickered. The soft, full-spectrum glow of the chamber dimmed to a sickly yellow, the color of a dying star. A soft, insistent alarm began to chime, the alert for atmospheric deviation. Life support analysis shows a 1.2% increase in inert xenon, a council member reported, his synthesized voice tight with panic. Impossible. The Emperor slammed his fist on the throne's control panel. Purge the atmosphere, reroute power from the tertiary systems. As he gave the command, the Grey Plague struck its next blow. The rerouted power, instead of flowing to the life support, was shunted into a feedback loop within the Sanctum's internal power grid. The insistent chime became a shrieking siren. Red warning lights bathed the chamber in a hellish glow. Another alarm screamed to life, the one for the magnetic containment of the room's miniature fusion core. Containment field fluctuating, another minister cried out. Power levels are unstable. This was the final piece. The throne itself was the plague's ultimate target. It was more than a chair. It was the Emperor's life support, his command interface, his connection to his own cybernetic implants. The power feedback loop, guided by 1 billion nanites, found its destination. It surged directly into the throne's core systems. From his distant moon, Reese saw the feed from the sanitation drone cut to static. The last thing he heard before the connection died was not a grand explosion, but the sharp, electric snap of a catastrophic overload and the beginning of a synthesized scream. Inside the sanctum, the Emperor's throne, the symbol of his absolute power, became his executioner. Its life support systems reversed polarity, instantly asphyxiating him. Its neural interface unleashed a torrent of corrupted data directly into his brain, shattering his consciousness. And its internal power cell, overloaded and uncontained, breached. The resulting blast was not large. The sanctum's walls easily absorbed it, but it was incredibly violent. In the space of a single second, the entire leadership of the Xylan technocracy was scoured from existence, not by an enemy fleet, but by a cascade of tiny, deliberate errors in the technology they worshipped. They were victims of a flawless assassination, a murder weapon that left no trace because the weapon was the room itself. The battle was over. Humanity had not fired a shot. The silence from Xylos was absolute. For 3 days, the heart of the technocracy issued no orders, no threats, no communications of any kind. The rest of the galaxy, which had been watching the Empire's bizarre, self-destructive implosion with a mixture of fear and confusion, held its collective breath. Sector lords, colonial governors, and fleet admirals, long accustomed to a constant stream of directives from the High Council, were met with unnerving static. The chain of command, so rigid and vital to the Xylan way of life, had been decapitated. The power vacuum was immediate and chaotic. Without the Emperor's authority, the Purity Inquisition collapsed. Rival admirals, no longer bound by loyalty to a dead sovereign, turned their fractured and unreliable fleets against each other, seeking to carve out their own petty kingdoms from the corpse of the Empire. The cargo haulers, their navigation systems still subtly flawed, delivered vital supplies to the wrong systems, sparking food riots and resource wars on dozens of worlds. The entire monolithic structure of the technocracy, already riddled with the cancer of the Grey Plague, shattered into 1,000 warring pieces. The Empire didn't fall, it evaporated. On Erebus, Rhys Valerius stood and walked away from his console for the first time in weeks. His work was done. The rage, the cold, methodical engine that had driven him, had finally sputtered out, leaving behind only the vast, quiet ache of his original loss. He looked at the readouts showing a galactic power in its death throes and felt nothing but a profound emptiness. He had proven his point. He had avenged Gizmo. He had shown the galaxy that the opposite of creation wasn't destruction, it was deconstruction. He had unmade a civilization piece by piece. With quiet, deliberate keystrokes, he compiled 2 data packages. The first contained the complete source code for the Grey Plague, its structure, its propagation methods, its insidious genius. The second contained the code for its only countermeasure, a targeted frequency broadcast that would cause the nanites to become inert, to bond into harmless, microscopic clumps of silicon and carbon. The cure. He then used the last of his lab's power to send both packages, anonymously, to every major government and media outlet in the known galaxy. He attached no message, no demands, no explanation. He simply sent the data, the poison and the antidote, and let it speak for itself. The effect was earth-shattering. The revelation that the mighty Xylan technocracy, the empire that worshipped technological purity, had been brought down by a technological virus of unimaginable sophistication, sent a wave of terror and awe through the galactic community. Military scientists and xenotechnologists dissected the code with a reverence usually reserved for cosmic artifacts. They saw its subtlety, its horrifying elegance. They understood that this was not a weapon of conquest, but a weapon of absolute deterrence. Most terrifying of all was its anonymity. No one knew who had created it or why, but the initial infection was traced back to a single, humble Terran data probe, launched from an uncharted moon in the galactic frontier. The implications were staggering. Humanity, long considered a disorganized, fractious, and technologically second-rate species, was suddenly viewed in a terrifying new light. They were the sleeping giant that, when prodded, could architect the silent ruin of an enemy from halfway across the galaxy. They didn't need fleets, they had ideas, and their ideas could be weaponized. A new galactic order began to form, not out of treaties or alliances, but out of a shared primal fear. The predatory expansion of the galaxy's major powers halted. Who knew what other horrors humanity kept hidden? What other retired engineers or quiet farmers held the keys to apocalyptic weapons on some forgotten backwater world? The anonymous message of the Grey Plague was clear. We can build worlds from dust, but we can also engineer your utter ruin. Tread carefully. Humanity itself was caught off guard. The Terran Federation furiously denied any involvement, and for once they were believed. This was not the work of a government. It was too clean, too personal. A legend began to spread through the fringe colonies, a whispered tale of a Xylan survey team, a murdered pet, and the quiet farmer who had repaid the debt. The story became a new kind of myth, a warning and a source of grim pride. On Erebus, Rhys initiated the final protocol. "Calypso," he said, his voice weary, "scrub all records, purge your core memory, initiate lab sterilization sequence." "Acknowledged, Director," The AI replied, her voice as calm as ever. It was an honor to work with you again. Goodbye. Reese walked out of the lab for the last time, not looking back as the hiss of incinerating plasma filled the chamber behind him, wiping away every trace of Project Cerberus and its terrible offspring. He sealed the entrance, and the wall became just a wall again, covered in old geological charts. He stepped out of his habitat into the dim twilight. The silence was back, but it was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the memory of a scruffy dog and the ghost of a fallen empire. He picked up his old reclamation shovel, its handle smooth from use, and walked out to his fields of hardy moss. There was a world to build. His war was over. He was a gardener again, and this time, he prayed, he would be left alone.